studying relationship between brains and behavior in dogs, primates, and humans. She's an assistant professor here at the Human Evolutionary Biology Department. She has a PhD in neuroscience from Emory and a bachelor's in cognitive neuroscience from UCSD, and personal expertise with dogs as a dog owner. She has a lead Australian Shepherd. So I'll hand it over to her just in terms of housekeeping notes. If you're attending on Zoom, please feel free to type or chat questions in the chat at any point. If you're a person attending the dinner, just gather here after the talk. If you haven't signed up but are interested in the dinner, just check in with us after.
Thank you, Parizad, for that. Thank you for that very nice introduction. Can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you guys today. I see some familiar faces. Thanks for coming. I guess my task for today was to give a introductory level introduction to dog brains and the dog brain research that we're doing here at Harvard. So my lab studies brain evolution in general. We don't just study dogs, we also study humans and other primates and other species, including some relatives of dogs, foxes. A couple of my dogs are up on that picture, and also my brain. So we're doing lots of stuff that's sort of loosely related to how brains evolve adaptive behaviors, so how brains change through evolution to produce adaptive behaviors. But what I'll talk to you about today is dogs. And Darwin saw dogs as a window on mechanisms of evolution. Some of the very first writing that he did about evolution and natural selection was about greyhounds. He wrote about how they seem to be just perfectly adapted to chasing and catching hare or rabbits. And then, of course, he also wrote a couple of volumes about evolution in the context of domestication. So sort of following in this line of thinking, we are looking at dogs as a natural experiment in brain behavior evolution. So we know how different lineages have been bred. We know what traits are under selection. So all we have to do is sort of look at their brains and see what evolution did in order to satisfy those selection requirements. So we have the Canine Brains Project here in this building down in the B4 level. We've been scanning dogs for a few years now. We kind of had to slow down during the pandemic, but this year we scanned our 100th dog just maybe a week or so ago, and we're on pace to keep scanning about 100 dogs a year from here on out, I think. So we invite dogs to visit the lab. We can do behavior tests with them. We also have owners give reports of their dog's normative behavior at home to sort of get a readout of what the dog's behavior is like in its sort of normal home environment. And then we do MRI scans with them using an expert veterinary team. And we're collecting really nice images thanks to our excellent staff at CBSN. So thank you guys. So what I'll talk about today is number one, how similar are dog brains and human brains, kind of just using the human brain as a familiar frame of reference to orient us to what's going on in dog brain anatomy. And then I'll talk about a few different topics that we've studied so far about how evolution has shaped the organization of dog brains. So this will include what happened to dog brains early in the domestication process. So what might have changed early on when dogs first became domesticated, how selection for different working skills like hunting and herding and guarding has been reshaping dogs' brains, how selection on skull shape, so like short round heads or long skinny heads, what that has done to brain anatomy, and then also selection on body size. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm happy to answer questions as I go along. Okay, so starting out with dog brains and human brains, how similar are they? So we're actually pretty far separated on this phylogenetic tree of mammals. So you can see here we have humans, and then way over here we have dogs. So we're more closely related to rats and other rodents than we are to dogs. All of the enlargement and increased complexity that happened in dog brains happened independently from that enlargement and increased complexity in human brains. Our last common ancestor with the ancestor of dogs was about 95 million years ago. So here's a human brain and a dog brain. They're not quite to scale, but maybe somewhere in the right range. Human brains are about 10 times the volume of dog brains. And there's actually a bit of variation among dog brains. They come in different sizes. So you can see just looking at this that there are some similarities and some differences. One similarity is that there's a high amount of gyrification in both dog brains and human brains. So if we look at the cerebral cortex here, which is this wrinkly outer covering of the brain, you can see there's a lot of wrinkles, a lot of folds and fissures, gyri and sulci in humans. And in dogs, there are not quite as many of these wrinkles, but there's still a lot compared to other mammal brains. And the general organization of the brain is the same. We have the cerebrum here and here, and then the cerebellum behind that, and the brainstem coming out of the cerebellum. So the last common ancestor of dogs and humans, which lived about 95 million years ago, probably looked a little bit something like this. And it had a relatively small, smooth, simple brain. This is an extrapolation of what that brain likely looked like. And you can see that a whole lot of it is devoted to odor processing here in piriform cortex. There's a large olfactory bulb, large cerebellum and hindbrain and brainstem. And then neocortical areas are pretty small, and there's almost no association cortex. So it's mainly taken up by primary sensory and motor regions. So sort of higher order cortical processing doesn't really get very much real estate in this critter's brain. And then these are endocasts from fossils of what is thought to be a mammalian common ancestor. So all of the increased complexity and enlargement we see in neocortex in both dogs and humans, that happened independently. So this is both really fascinating from a scientific perspective and also something that gives us a bit of trouble because we're kind of like off the map. We have really good maps for rodent brain anatomy and human brain anatomy, but dog brains have a lot of enlargement and complexity in cerebral cortex that just really hasn't been studied yet. So we know where primary sensory and motor regions are, and subcortical regions are highly conserved as they are across all mammals, but lots of what's going on in cortex is a little bit more unknown. So just to give you a quick tour of some subcortical regions that we can identify in both dogs and humans. Here's the thalamus in humans and in dogs. So this is sort of like a sensory relay station where auditory and visual and somatosensory information that's coming into the body is processed before being sent out to different regions of the brain for further processing. The hypothalamus is present in both dogs and humans. So this is a region that in introductory neuroscience textbooks, they say is responsible for the 4 Fs: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction. And then there are also other subcortical regions like the amygdala and hippocampus and caudate. All of these regions are present in both dog and human brains and in mammal brains generally and have basically the same function. And then these primary sensory and motor regions, as I said, are also located in similar locations in dog and human brains. So focusing here on the dog brains, we have primary visual cortex in the back of the brain in the occipital lobe, as it is in humans. The olfactory bulb is at the sort of base of the frontal lobe, which I'll get a little bit into more on the next slide. There's a lot of increased complexity in the dog olfactory system. Auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. Somatosensory, motor, and premotor cortex and prefrontal cortex sort of have their familiar arrangement around the central part of the dorsal part of the brain. So looking at olfactory cortex, as you can imagine, dogs have olfaction as one of their primary ways of interacting with the world. And a lot of their brain real estate is devoted to olfaction, much more than in humans. So there is a olfactory epithelium that lines the nasal turbinates, which are these like really complex honeycomb-like air passages in the dog's snout. And this epithelium lines these really complex interwoven air chambers. And that's the sensory surface on which olfactory receptors are located. So as air is being drawn into the dog's nose, there's a really big surface area where these odorant molecules can connect with receptors and be sensed by the dog. So in dogs, that olfactory epithelium is about 30 square inches, and in humans, it's about 1 square inch. So we just have much less surface area available for detecting odors in the environment. And then dogs also have this massive olfactory bulb, an olfactory tract leading into the brain, and then a large piriform cortex, which is a site of sensory awareness for olfaction. So you can just see by looking at the outside of the dog brain, major tracts of real estate that are devoted to the sense of smell. And in humans, if you have any familiarity with human brain anatomy, this is absolutely not the case. So this is my brain, and I think that's my olfactory bulb, but it's kind of hard to tell because the resolution of the scan is not quite high enough to actually pick it out. So here's an image where the olfactory bulbs have been colored yellow to make them a little bit easier to see. And we can't really even see piriform cortex here because it's kind of tucked up under the lip of the temporal lobe here, and it's really small. So we just have vastly less neural matter devoted to olfaction than dogs do. And then as we sort of move out of these primary sensory and motor regions, correspondences in higher order association areas are much more uncertain. For one thing, the temporal lobe evolved independently in primates and carnivores. If you remember the image of the ancestral mammal brain, it didn't have a temporal lobe. It was just sort of one smooth lump. And the same is true for mouse or rat brains. So the enlargement of this temporal lobe and the formation of a whole separate lobe for temporal cortex happened totally independently in primates and carnivores. Also, there's been a debate going on for years that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in particular might be unique to primates and might not have any homologue in non-primate animals. One defining feature of human brains is that they're asymmetrical, and dog brains are also pretty asymmetrical. And interestingly, a lot of this asymmetry occurs in the left temporal lobe. So the left regions of the left temporal lobe are larger, volumetrically larger than regions of the right temporal lobe. And this hot spot in that asymmetry is in the caudal ectosylvian gyrus, which is a part of the brain that activates when dogs hear human speech, particularly speech that is meaningful to the dog. The same thing is true in humans. In humans, the part of the brain that's involved in recognizing and understanding meaningful language is Wernicke's area, and it's also larger in the left hemisphere. So that's pretty amazing because this is a trait that either has really, really deep roots, so deep that it goes back to that tiny, like little smooth-brained, simple mammalian ancestor, or it evolved independently in dogs and humans. Okay, so kind of transitioning to how dog brains have been shaped by evolution. So one thing that might be helpful to understand is sort of like a 30,000-foot view of dog evolution in general. So it's thought that wolves self-domesticated sometimes between 20 and 40,000 years ago. The date for domestication of wolves into dogs is sort of debated. It goes back and forth every few years, depending on what type of research is being used to make the estimation, but sometime in that range. The ancestors of domestic dogs, which were a species of wolf that is now extinct, was hanging around in areas where humans were also creating some of the first human settlements. And the current thinking is that these dog ancestors that were least afraid of humans and could make humans least afraid of them were able to obtain fitness benefits in the form of scrapping food, basically, from these settlements. So there's two important things there. The animals had to be less afraid of people, have less of a flight or fight response towards people, and they had to make humans less afraid of them. So they had to somehow indicate with their behavior that they weren't a threat and shouldn't be chased off or killed. So gradually over time, those animals, through the course of natural selection, rather than artificial selection by humans, just natural selection acting on that species, became a different species, the first domestic dogs. And domestic dogs, most of the domestic dogs in the world still live in this niche. So about 80% of the dogs living on the planet today are what's known as village dogs. So these are free-ranging animals that live as human commensals. So they're living within human society, but they're not pets. They usually don't go inside houses. They're usually not provisioned, although provisioning does sometimes happen, particularly for mother dogs that have pups. And they're still reproducing under natural selection rather than artificial selection. So they're making their own breeding decisions. Humans aren't selectively breeding them intentionally, but their natural environment is embedded within the human social world. And then it's only relatively recently in some parts of the world where we had this really intensive artificial selection leading to breed formation. So most of the dogs that we're familiar with today that are pets in the part of the world that we live in now, those breeds were formed in the last couple hundred years, which is really an eye blink in evolutionary time. So as everybody I think knows, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, why do the village dogs, they kind of all end up looking like this? So why, like, even if they're kind of like rewilded, like they escaped from, and then like the next generation or two that diversity disappears, like what is it about this phenotype that seems to just be winning?
Yeah, okay, so the question for the people on Zoom was, why do all village dogs across the world look more or less the same? Or if you let sort of breed dogs from the like modern lineages kind of rewild themselves over time after many generations, they start looking like this again too. The answer is that is the most fit, the most adaptive phenotype for a dog living in that environment. So that you'll notice they don't have floppy ears. Floppy ears tend to get infections. They're a certain size because that size is large enough to get the food that they need without being so large that they need more food than they're able to obtain. Okay, so as we all know, different breeds of dogs have been intentionally, artificially selected by humans for different appearances, different temperaments or personalities, and also working skills. So if we think about this initial phenotype, the first domestic dogs, we can ask, what is it about their brains that makes their behavior different from modern breed dogs? So to do that, we compared a sample of dogs that we scanned here at Harvard, including New Guinea singing dogs, which are ancestral to dingoes, so some of the earliest domesticated dogs, village dogs, so dogs coming from lineages that have never been pets, have always been reproducing under natural selection in different parts of the world, and then ancient breed dogs, some of which are local to this part of the world. This is a Kishu Ken. Another one is a Shiba Inu that people are probably familiar with. So we can compare these pre-modern and ancient type of dogs with modern breed dogs like Labradors, Border Collies, German Shepherd Pointers, and so forth. So this is a new result hot off the press from like a week ago, which I'm really excited about. So you can see that in red here, we have regions that are expanded in the pre-modern dogs. And in blue, we have regions that are expanded in the modern dogs. So the entire amygdala is just much bigger in pre-modern dogs than in modern dogs. This might have something to do with a need for environmental monitoring and vigilance. So you could think of the amygdala as sort of detecting things that are emotionally salient in the surrounding environment. And emotions are motivators for adaptive behaviors, like run away from this or eat this or try to mate with this. So pre-modern dogs, because their brains have been shaped by natural selection rather than artificial selection, their behavioral repertoire might have more of a need to be able to make these types of adaptive behavioral decisions than modern dogs do. Meanwhile, modern dogs, like Labradors, Border Collies, and so forth, have expansion in neocortex. This might have something to do with selection for working skills, because a lot of the dogs that we've been scanning here at CBS are working dogs. Okay, so then kind of moving on to working skills, we could ask how selective breeding for different types of working skills has affected dog brains. So as I think everybody knows, there are lineages of dogs that have been selectively bred for things like livestock herding, which is a type of modified predatory behavior that's displayed towards the livestock. So they display a stalking sequence towards livestock, which the livestock animals are instinctively afraid of and instinctively move away from, and that's how herding happens. Meanwhile, there are livestock guardian breeds that don't display predatory behavior towards livestock. They actually treat the livestock like conspecifics and they protect them, but they're their primary social partners. They might even attempt to mate with the livestock. And then we have hunting dogs that are specialized in hunting by sight or by scent. And then other types of dogs that don't really have specific working skills, but rather temperaments that are useful for people in particular contexts, like being sort of surly and wanting to bark at intruders, being useful for defending people or property, or being really cute and cuddly and providing entertainment and companionship within a household. So if we believe that behavior comes from the brain, which I think we all here do, then there has to be something different about the brains of these animals that's producing these really marked differences in behavior. So this is an analysis that we did with a data set before we started doing work here at Harvard. So these scans were acquired opportunistically from an MRI or from a veterinary center in Georgia. So these were dogs that were referred for neurological examinations because they thought there might be some kind of neurological problem, but then no neurological problem was identified. So as far as we can tell, these are neurologically normal dogs. So here are some screenshots of parasagittal sections of dogs of familiar breeds. And you can tell just by looking at this that there are just sort of gross differences in what's going on inside the head. So for example, if you look at a really small dog, like the Yorkshire Terrier, the head is sort of globular and it's really squeezed into the skull. It's like taking up all available space inside the skull. And then if you look at a larger dog, like a golden retriever, the brain has a sort of more elongated shape. This is more like an ancestral canid brain phenotype. And a lot of the space in the skull is actually air rather than brain, which if you have a golden retriever, maybe not so surprising. So we can see just by looking at this that there's some like gross differences in how the brain is shaped and oriented within the skull. So then here are those same brains scaled to a constant rostrocaudal width. So you can see that we have some pretty robust differences in size, although the difference in size doesn't keep pace with the difference in body size. So if you look at our Yorkshire Terrier brain and then our Golden Retriever brain, the Yorkie brain is like less, or maybe like a little bit more than half the size of the Golden Retriever brain, but the body of the Yorkie is much less than half the size of the Golden Retriever body. So brain scale with body size, but not as robustly as body size. And then here are those same brains scaled to a constant length. So you can see that we have differences not just in size, but also in overall shape. And maybe you could start to notice some differences in sulcal morphology. So here's a heat map representing the anatomical variation across the data set. So we can see that variation is not randomly spread out over the entire brain. It's concentrated in particular regions. And then we can query that variation and try to understand what differentiates the brains of different breeds using a type of independent components analysis. So this basically asks which regions in the brain co-vary in size across the data set. So could I identify a network of regions where if one region is bigger, then statistically other regions in that same network are bigger or smaller in coordination with the first one. So we're looking at networks of regions whose size changes together predictably across the entire data set. And then once we've identified those regions, we can ask what variables account for the variation in those regions. So the thing that we're interested in really is behavior, but we have to investigate some other like sort of less exciting, slightly disappointing, but probably real potential explanations for variation in brain anatomy across dog breeds, which include things like total brain size or body size, skull shape, and genetic drift. So here are these networks. So this first network includes brain regions that are involved in processing drive and reward, including the caudate, nucleus accumbens, and medial prefrontal cortex. The second network includes higher order olfactory regions, including piriform cortex. The third network includes regions that are involved in moving the body, moving the eyes, and spatial navigation or representation of space, including the hippocampus, LGN, some ocular motor nuclei. The fourth network has brain regions that activate in fMRI studies when dogs see or hear humans or other dogs. And this prefrontal region here is a region of the brain that enlarged in carnivore evolution around the same time that pack hunting came on the scene. So we think that these regions are involved in social communication and social coordination. And then this fifth network has brain regions that are involved in the HPA axis, so flight or fight responses, hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus. And then the fifth network has the olfactory bulb and primary visual cortex. Okay, so these are the 6 networks that describe variation in the brains across the data set. So sort of like maximally describe anatomical variation in the data set. And now we can ask what accounts for this variation. And sort of one of the boring but potentially real explanations that I mentioned a couple slides ago was genetic drift. So we know that domestic dog breeds have been created through these, relatively small founder populations. So you could imagine a scenario where the founding population for a particular breed just happened to have a smaller amygdala or something by chance. And then all of the descendants of that very small founding population might continue to have a smaller amygdala in no relation to any sort of meaningful impact on behavior just by chance. So if that was going to be the case, we should be able to predict the anatomy of these 6 networks through the dog breed phylogenetic tree. And that was not the case. The amount of predictive validity that you get from using this phylogenetic tree to explain variation in those 6 networks is almost 0. So this indicates that there's been very strong recent specific selection in individual breeds rather than founding effects in ancestral founding populations. So then we could look at behavior and ask whether the types of behaviors that different lineages have been selected for historically, whether that explains each dog's anatomy in these 6 brain networks. And it seems like there are some interesting relationships here. So all of these outlined boxes are statistically significant after multiple comparisons correction. And I'll just highlight a few interesting things. So breeds that historically have been under selection just for companionship, so lap dogs that live in human households and their only job is to be social partners for humans, their strongest association was with this network of brain regions involved in social communication and social coordination. Let's see, both breeds that were historically selected for bird fleshing and retrieving and sight hunting, their strongest association is with this network that involves brain regions that move the body, move the eyes, and contribute to spatial navigation. So you could think if your job is to watch something that's moving across the environment and then get your body to that thing and bring it back, those are probably important brain networks. That's probably an important brain network for you. The lineages that have been selected for scent hunting, meanwhile, their strongest association is with this olfactory network. And dogs that historically were developed for sport fighting, their strongest association is with this HPA axis network that includes the amygdala and hypothalamus. There are some other relationships here that might be harder to explain, but it seems like there is a pattern here that we're picking up some sort of signal of historical selection on behavior across modern dog breeds. And the interesting thing here is that as far as we know, none of these dogs were working dogs. They were all just household pets. So what we're seeing here is the impact of artificial selection in ancestral generations, rather than any sort of plasticity or experience-dependent effects in these individual dogs. But of course, we know that working skills in dogs are an outcome. Oh, question.
Yeah.
Yep.
So all these correlations are positive. So for instance, the explicit companionship, it seems to be like a slight positive correlation towards the fear. But so it's not that can be negative, right? Like it's actually decreasing their gender response.
Yeah, so these are positive associations, but it's one thing to keep in mind is that each of these 6 networks has both a positive, and so the red component and the blue component are anti-correlated. So we could go back and figure out like whether positive association with a particular historical selection is increased with expansion or reduction in each component of the component, so the red part or the blue part.
So it's possible that it's actually the fear networks being reduced. Given
It is. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so working skills are an outcome both of innate biases or traits within dogs. So dog has to have a desire and motivation to herd or hunt or whatever. But then training is almost always necessary. I have yet to hear of any particular breed of working dog where it just is born knowing how to do its job. Training is part of it. So in our current work, we're scanning dogs that are real world working dogs that are out there doing this kind of work every day. That's their normal life. And then dogs that come from the same lineages, the same working lineages that were under selection for this type of behavior, but didn't undergo training or started to undergo training and then were identified as not responding to training. So like washouts. And we're looking both at historical breed specialized skills like livestock herding and bird hunting and so forth. But we're also looking at more modern working skills, like providing mobility assistance for people in wheelchairs, providing assistance for visually impaired people, and scent detection for threats or missing persons. So we're hoping that this will tell us both what it is about particular types of dog brains that predisposes them to a particular working skill, but also what happens to that brain phenotype when it undergoes the type of experience that evolution is expecting. And this work is being led by Sophie Barton, who's a grad student in my lab. Okay, so another sort of non-behavioral explanation that I mentioned for variation in dog brain anatomy is head shape. So dogs have this extreme variation in facial morphology or skull morphology. If you think of a pug, like their face is almost completely flat. It's so flattened that they have medical issues associated with the shape of their snout. And on the other hand, if we think about like a greyhound or a Saluki, they have these really long, narrow, pointy heads. That type of variation in skull shape, I don't think exists within any one species anywhere else in the animal kingdom. So this is a really interesting opportunity to look at how the skull and brain interact in their development. So this is another analysis that was done by Sophie. And so if we look at breeds that have been selected for this like short, round, flat facial morphology like boxers or pugs, we see reductions in gray matter in the front of the brain and in the back of the brain. So that sort of makes sense. If the whole skull is getting sort of smushed and foreshortened, the same thing is happening to the brain. Meanwhile, if we look at dogs with long, slender heads like a Saluki or a greyhound, we see the same thing happening on the sides of the brain. So their temporal lobes and sort of lateral cortical areas are all sort of reduced. So this is maybe not a super surprising finding, like the brain is inside the skull. So it seems like it just sort of stands to reason that if you're manipulating the shape of the skull, you're going to be manipulating the shape of the brain. But this sort of confirms that. Dogs with these extreme skull morphotypes have impacts on their brain anatomy that likely affect behavior. So we could think about how selection on physical morphology and selection on behavior might interact in evolution in dogs. So if a lineage is being selected just for physical morphology, then genetic variants that are under positive selection are going to be influencing skull development. That might have secondary effects on brain development and then tertiary effects on behavior. On the other hand, if the people that are selectively breeding the dogs don't care at all about the dog's appearance and they just care about its behavior, then variants under positive selection are probably influencing brain development. This may have secondary impacts on the skull because the skull and brain co-develop. But then effects on behavior will sort of be primary to those selection effects on the brain. What we think probably happens most of the time is that both of those things are under selection at once. So most working skills involve the body because that's how dogs work, is through using their body to interact with the world. So traits that are behaviors that are under positive selection, like for example, bite force, might involve both some component of differential brain organization, maybe a motivation to bite, or a willingness to engage in aggressive-like behaviors in controlled contexts. But meanwhile, there may also be constraints on the skull. So particular skull morphologies offer benefits for how strongly the jaws can close. So this idea of bite force being related to skull morphology, I think, is a pretty straightforward example of how selection on behavior might influence the skull. Another example is in racing dogs. We've seen, most like racing dogs have this really long, slender head morphology. And we've noticed in our scans that they have a really large frontal sinus. And that might have something to do with cooling the brain during prolonged exertive activity. So I'm guessing that probably most of the time when we're thinking about selection for working behaviors, selection is happening both on the skull and the brain at the same time. Okay.
So does that also mean that they have more, like, they can pull the air over their brain, like kind of a golden retrievers, you're seeing
Yep.
air on the top? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the air does not actually contact the brain, but there's an air cavity kind of like right next to where the brain cavity is. Yeah. It gives us lots of trouble when we're scanning because there's a lot of artifact produced by that. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so then the last thing I want to talk about was selection on body size. So this is another example where there is more within species variation in this particular trait than I think any other species in the animal kingdom. So if you think of like a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, or like any other breeds of really small and really large dogs, the differences in body mass can be huge, like 100 times. And that just doesn't exist elsewhere in the animal kingdom. So if you've ever taken a comparative or evolutionary neuroscience class, or maybe my class, you would be familiar with this effect. So as brains get larger, if you're looking across species, as brains get larger, different components of the brain enlarge at different rates. So as a brain changes size, it doesn't scale linearly. Some regions get bigger faster than other regions. And neocortex gets bigger the fastest. So in this graph, all of these different dots are individual species from different clades. So yellow are primates. This one dot up here is humans, the highest dot. So we have the most neocortex for our body size. So as brains get bigger, neocortex gets bigger faster than other brain regions. So here's an illustration showing this across a few primate species. Chimpanzee brains are quite a bit larger than lemur brains. Even though these sections are shown at the same size, you can look at these scale bars to see that chimpanzee brains are quite a bit larger than lemur brains. And chimpanzee brains have proportionally much more neocortex than lemur brains. So this is one of the most well-validated, thoroughly studied phenomena in comparative neuroscience. It's been known for like 20 years now, and it's just like a really landmark finding, but so far had only been observed in a cross-species context. But it also occurs in dog brains. So if we look at which regions of the brain are enlarged are enlarged or contracted in relation to brain size, these red regions are larger in dogs with bigger brains, and the blue regions are smaller in dogs with larger brains. So this is exactly the same pattern as we see across other mammalian species, but within species context. Also, this pattern seems to be a major driving factor of variation in temperament or personality across dog breeds. So it's been known for a long time that different breeds of dogs have different temperaments. I think this is something that basically anybody that interacts with dogs kind of knows. Golden retrievers have different personalities than Chihuahuas. That's not to say that every golden retriever is identical, or that some Chihuahuas don't have more golden retriever-like qualities than other Chihuahuas, but on average, breed is a significant predictor of temperament across dog breeds. And this is measured with this assessment called CBARC, the Canine Behavioral Assessment and Research Questionnaire. It's a survey that's filled out by the dog's owner, and it assesses behaviors that can be noticed in basically any sort of home context, like fear towards unknown humans or unknown dogs, trainability, excitability, aggression towards people that the dog knows or doesn't, or dogs that the dog knows or doesn't, and so forth. So prior research has strongly linked this breed-related variation in temperament to body size. There was one study that collected CBARC data on 32,000 dogs from 82 different breeds, and then performed clustering on the survey responses. And the data clustered more on the body height of the dogs than on breed relatedness. So size was a better predictor than breed in predicting temperament scores on this CBARC assessment. Breed differences in CBARC scores are linked to variants of a gene called IGF-1, which is a glucose receptor gene, and it's a determinant of body size. So across breeds, body size is a major determinant of temperament, and this is something that's been known for a long time. And if we go back to our brain data, if you look at the regions of the brain that are enlarged in larger dogs, these same regions of the brain are reduced in dogs that score high on all of these different problem behaviors, all of these different types of aggression and fear, excitability, and so forth. Meanwhile, these regions of the brain that are expanded in larger brain dogs are expanded in dogs that have higher scores on trainability. So it seems like the brain correlates of breed differences in temperament really overlap very strongly with brain correlates of variation in total brain size. So it looks like we have this sort of trade-off going on. On the one hand, dogs that have larger brains have proportionally more cortex, which probably allows for increased behavioral flexibility and top-down control of instinctual or emotional responses to external stimuli. They have increased trainability and reduced anxiety and aggression. On the other hand, dogs that have small brains have proportionally less cortex, reduced trainability, and increased anxiety and aggression. So these major differences in temperament across dog breeds that seem to be linked to body size can probably boil down to the ratio of cortex to subcortical regions. So it looks like brain morphology and temperament are very tightly linked to total brain size, not just because having more brain makes the dog smarter and sort of better behaved, but because these shifts in total brain size carry along with them shifts in the relative size of different regions. Okay, so to sort of wrap up, there's a surprising amount of diversity in dog brains. I think that the amount of diversity inside dogs' heads might rival the amount of diversity outside their heads and the rest of their bodies. It seems like pretty much any sort of comparison that we do among different lineages of dogs comes up with significant results. So I think there's just really a lot of variation. And we can trace these differences in dog behavior to differences in brain organization. This offers sort of a natural experiment on brain behavior evolution. And I think one major take-home point that we can bring from this work on dogs that probably applies to all animals in general is that if selection pressure is really steep, as it is in artificial selection, and it may have been at various points in our own evolution and may be periodically in the evolution of animals in general, when that selection pressure is really steep, brain behavior evolution can happen very quickly. And domestication is a nice window on how this happens because we know what the selection pressures are because we're applying them. So our lab is always looking for participants, both human and canine. We have 3 studies going on right now. There's the working breed study that I talked about a few slides ago. We also have a study looking at how early life experience is related to fear and aggression later in life. So we're looking for dogs that both did and did not have stressful experiences early in life, like having been in a shelter, and that both do and do not have aggression issues currently. We also have an attachment study. So in this study, we're going to be scanning both children and dogs at the point when the dog becomes adopted into the household, and then again several months later after a bond has formed. So the idea is to look at the brain correlates of the development of that bond and understand how those bonds help to buffer stress both in children and in dogs. So if you or somebody you know has children and is thinking about adopting a dog, we would love to hear from you. We're also always recruiting veterinary and research staff. In particular, right now, we're looking for either a postdoc or a research assistant with experience in MRI to assist with a human study, although people are always welcome to get involved in other studies in the lab. There's our website if you'd like to learn more about any of this. Thank you very much for your attention. Be happy to answer any questions.
Focused very much on brain area sizes.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I was sort of teased or tantalized at the beginning. You had some kind of DTI tractography.
Mm-hmm.
So have you or have others in the field looked at connectivity and circuitry and information transfer, either by in vivo studies or post-mortem?
Yeah.
Because I know you can't do this experimentally.
Right. Yeah. So in the first set of data that we got from the veterinary clinic in Georgia, there was no DTI data, but we have now been acquiring that here at CVS. So we have DTI data, and then we also have resting state functional connectivity data. The dogs are anesthetized during the scan, but we can still get resting state fMRI. So that will be coming soon.
And it's little peeks into the data, because one might think that it's not going to be about size, it's going to be about association, connectivity, and integration of information that leads to these interesting socialized kinds of functions.
Yeah. Yeah, I share that suspicion. We haven't analyzed any of the data from this data set yet. Like I said, we just finished our 100th dog, and we're sort of like just starting to do preliminary analyses now, but yeah, hopefully coming soon.
Thanks for phenomenal talk. I'm just wondering what's your take on recent studies suggesting that dog breeds may not be a very reliable predictor for certain types of behaviors. It obviously contradicts a little bit with finding the brain size differences. So could it be that there's functional differences independent of just brain size area variation?
Yeah. Okay. So you're talking about the Morrill paper that came from the Carlson lab. There is another paper, the first author is Dutro, that came from the Ostrander lab that came out shortly thereafter. So what these two papers took two very different approaches to measuring dog behavior. One of them measured behavior, the Morrill paper measured behavior in individual breeds. The way that they assessed behavior included some questions that probably had more to do with human perceptions of dog behavior than the dog's behavior itself, like questions like, my dog knows that it's a dog, or my dog loves me. And then they kind of tested whether each breed was a snowflake rather than testing whether breed was had any predictive value. So if you look in their supplementary data, supplementary figure 12 shows that there are breed differences in behavior. On the other hand, what the Dutro paper did from the Ostrander lab was to look at lineages of dogs. So rather than treating each individual breed as a snowflake, they looked at groups of related breeds. So like scent hunting lineages versus livestock herding lineages, that type of thing. And that paper did find significant differences in behavior.
Where does the coyote start to the eastern side?
We have not yet studied coyotes. That would be fascinating. I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding is that there are almost no real coyotes left because introgression from dogs has been so intense. So I would guess that coyotes are starting to have some behavioral predispositions that include some of the types of things that dogs have been under selection for, like reduced fear of humans. But yeah, I think Cody's would be fascinating to look at.
So I'm not in brain science. I have a very specific question about my dogs.
Okay.
And I was told once, the little one was blinded at age 1. They're age 14, 15 now. And he could never find a snack, sniffing, but he seems to smell things from afar. And then the Westie used to be able to smell things on the floor or on your hand. Can't anymore. But if I open the refrigerator, and I don't know if that's hearing or open the cheese, he's out here in a shot. But then he cannot find it on the floor.
Wow.
He has to bump into it.
I have no idea. That's fascinating.
I was told that the dogs had 2 different smells, like up close and far away, and
they do have like 2 different sort of sets of behaviors that they use when trying to track. One is an initial orienting, where they like have their nose up and they're smelling in multiple directions, and then the other is like once they found a trail, they kind of have their nose to the ground. So maybe, yeah.
This is a total dissonance. Okay.
Yeah.
So over time, humans have selected dogs for lots of very specific functions, at least last couple of years with the establishment of modern breeds. And as you know, that's precipitate a lot of change in their brains to facilitate these new roles. Are there any features of the brains of dogs that lend themselves to generality? So are there any features of a dog's brain that lend themselves to being able to do lots of different things as opposed to just being really good at a specific thing?
Yeah, my suspicion is that result we were seeing where trainability was associated with overall expansion in neocortex, that might have something to do with general behavioral flexibility or learning and memory abilities, which might be able to be deployed in different contexts depending on the dog's environment and experience. So there are particular breeds of dogs that seem to often be used for different types of novel working tasks. Labradors, golden retrievers, and German shepherds seem to be some major players. So when a group of people is, trying to develop a new type of working dog for a novel function, like being a seeing eye dog or a scent detection dog that could work in like a disaster site, they seem to settle on those types of breeds. And I wonder if what they're tapping into there is a capacity for behavioral flexibility and just general learning and memory. In the front.
Hi, yeah, very interesting talk. I also have no background in academia, but I do train dogs, and I'm interested in terms of your conclusion was saying basically that based on selection that brain changes and genetic changes can happen very quickly. What does very quickly mean? Like what type of time frame do you guys mean by that?
Well, so in the breeds of dogs that we're studying now, those breeds have their emergence within the past few hundred years, like they were mostly created in the Victorian era. They came from ancestral populations that probably had some of those types of working behaviors that were under selection before that. So it's not like they were sort of created out of the ether 200 years ago. But yeah, in terms of like how quickly can brain changes happen? Some good evidence, I think, comes from this Russian farm fox experiment, which was a intentional artificial selection experiment that was supposed to recapitulate domestication using foxes instead of dogs. So they started breeding together foxes that were most tolerant of human contact and most friendly towards people. And after just 10 generations of doing that, 10 years, they had foxes that were significantly different from their initial founding population, which prefer to avoid human contact if they can. So it seems like it can happen as quickly as 10 generations, at least for something very simple like reduced flight or fight response towards humans.
Glucose result, is that, I'm guessing that's a GWAS based?
Yeah.
Okay, is there any like more involved study following up on that? Like if I would return that in mice, I would get big brain and small brain mice, or?
Great question. Not that I'm aware of. It sounds like a cool experiment. Is
I
that-
have my own questions, and then I'm going to read some Zoom questions that are coming in. One question I was wondering is about sex-based differences, like how much is known about that in dogs as compared to human beings?
Yeah, so I think some of our best information on like working dog behavior comes from the people that have been breeding and training working dogs like their whole lives. I think they have a lot of sort of applied knowledge. And as far as I can tell, there don't seem to be preferences for male versus female dogs for any working roles that I've come across yet, which might suggest that there are reduced sex differences in dogs compared to some other mammalian species, at least in the context of these working behaviors. When we did that initial analysis that was looking at breed group differences, we also looked for sex differences, and we did find significant sex differences. But because that was an opportunistic data set, we didn't have males and females evenly distributed across the breeds. We know that there are breed differences, so then we feel like we couldn't really interpret the sex differences, but we'll be able to look at that in our current data. I think another interesting thing about dogs is that removing the testes or the ovaries is a commonplace. So we can examine the effect of early hormonal exposure on brain development versus continued hormonal exposure after puberty.
So we have a question from Charles on Zoom. How much work is being done on dog neurogenetics? For example, will it be possible to identify genes that have evolved under behavioral selection and perhaps identify the cell types in which they are expressed?
So far, not much, but we're hoping to get a start at that with our life experience study. So we're targeting dogs that have risk and non-risk alleles that were identified in a prior GWAS study as affecting fear and aggression behavior. So the idea is to look at how those risk and non-risk alleles interact with presence or absence of early life stress and the development of behavioral and neurophenotypes in adulthood.
One more Zoom question. Nicholas asks, I would be grateful if you could tell us more about the behavioral tests that your team made with the dogs. So I'm not sure exactly which test, but maybe if you want to share some different behavioral tests that you can do in the laboratory.
Sure, yeah. So we have a class every fall. It's wrapping up now this year, where students do behavior tests with the dogs, and then they analyze the data in final projects. So the tests that we're doing this semester involve looking at paw preference. So like humans have left or right hand dominance, some dogs have left or right paw dominance, and that's related to working behavior and also some aspects of emotionality. So we have a paw preference test. We have a test of empathy where the owner pretends to injure themselves with a hammer and then starts crying. And then like, it's amazing, like some dogs could just be off like sniffing the floor over in the corner, and other dogs are like jumping all over the person or like even taking the hammer away. We look at how the dogs respond to being left alone in the room, how they respond to meeting a new person, whether they prefer to interact with a new person versus the owner. Let's see, we have an impossible task where the dog is presented with a treat that it can't get to that's like inside an unopenable container. And then the test is to see whether the dog sort of tries to open the container independently or looks to a human to ask for help. I think that's all the ones that we're doing so far. We've done other sort of like at-home behavior studies. One of them is looking at howling behavior. So for dogs that howl in response to a predictable auditory stimulus, like a particular sound or siren, we've been sending the owners upshifted or downshifted variants of that sound, and then measuring whether the dog howls along, whether the dog modulates the tone of its voice in order to match the stimulus, and that's work that we're doing with Ani Patel at Tufts.
My background is in speech and acoustic communication systems. I'm wondering if you teased out the differences between dogs that regularly communicate with dogs versus dogs that regularly with humans. I think it's going to be related to your life experience that you were some. I mean, I'm assuming most of the dogs are going to be in almost with humans for the most part, but I guess you would have to study village dogs versus English dogs versus fully domesticated dogs.
Yeah, that is a fascinating question. no, we haven't looked at that yet. Although I just remembered actually one initial connectivity finding that just a student just came up with like a week ago. So it didn't pop into my head right away, but there is a major white matter tract that connects the vocal production regions and the vocal receptive regions in the dog brain. So in humans and other primates, this is called the arcuate fasciculus. In dogs, because their brains evolved that complexity completely independent of ours, it's probably analogous to the arcuate fasciculus rather than homologous, but it looks like the arcuate fasciculus. So that would be an interesting thing to look at in that context.
I have a question. I was a little bit late, so this might have been in your introduction, but how did you get interested in working with dogs?
So I was a primate neuroscientist by training. I was doing primate and human stuff, trying to understand what makes human brains different from other primates. And then one day I was sitting on the couch watching TV, and this TV show came on about dogs and foxes and evolution and genetics and behavior, but there was no neuroscience. And I thought, this is wild. How is there no neuroscience? This is like the perfect thing. So that TV show talked about the Russian farm fox program. So I emailed the person that directs that in Russia. I don't think she speaks English, but she managed to get it translated somehow and sent me some fox brains. And then I started sort of fishing around at local vet clinics and trying to figure out how I could get my hands on dog scans.
Do you have a dog?
I have a couple dogs. So my partner has a big, like, he's like 90 pounds. His name is Gunny. And then I have this little fluffy excuse for a dog named Izzy, who's adorable, and a handful.
Hello. Yeah, on the screen. Can I ask you a question about novelty based on observations of our dogs? Our dog is a Bichon Shih Tzu mix, and it's been interesting to us how important it is to him to sniff, and his sniffing and his willingness actually to walk increases greatly with novelty. And we've noticed recently that one of my kids has gotten all these puzzles where you hide food under various shapes, and the dog, has to get them. And the dog actually prefers sometimes to get its food from the puzzle, than from the bowl, where it's much easier. And so I'm just wondering whether sort of a certain amount of novelty actually is requisite to the mental health of dogs, and that they seek to find it where they can.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. And then I think animals in general are motivated to engage in behaviors that are adaptive for them. So for dogs, ancestrally, sniffing around to find food was super adaptive. So that behavior itself is rewarding. You might be able to think of like similar types of things with humans, like we find puzzles adaptive, like, I don't know, Sudoku puzzles or things like that. Maybe because engaging in sort of cognitively challenging, complex behaviors like that was adaptive for us historically. So doing something that sort of taps into that adaptive pattern of behavior just feels good.
Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. I'm curious how much work has been done in canine maternal care, and as traits like working with has been adapted on the maternal care.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually some really cool work, mainly being done by a person named Emily Bray, looking at how maternal behavior with a litter of puppies influences the later working behavior of those puppies. And so, yeah, it does have an impact. In modern breed domestic dogs, the father usually does not contribute very much to parental care. In village dogs, it looks like the father contributes in maybe like 20% of cases, mainly in the form of playing with the puppies. And then if we look at ancestral canids, like wolves, there is biparental care. So it seems like in the process of becoming domesticated and being living around human settlements rather than living in sort of larger packs, dogs lost that biparental care behavior.
there aren't any last questions, I just want to thank you so much for the wonderful talk and the audience for your really wonderful questions, and we can gather here for lunch. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming.